The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. This is module 4. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So just the normal process, could I just ask you to go to the question box on the right-hand side, just type in the word clear. That will let me know that I'm coming across. Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Julie. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is fantastic. The normal process is if you've got questions or comments, please don't hesitate to type them into the question box where you wrote in the word clear, and I'll deal with those as we go through the hour. So I won't just leave them until the last minute. I will deal with them as we deal with them as they come up. All right, look, first of all, I want to apologise to you for changing the date. This was scheduled, of course, for Friday, but it was unavoidable. So I just wanted to apologise again for any inconvenience that caused. But nevertheless, we're here now, so that's great. And of course, I won't be changing the date for the next session. It will remain not next Friday, but the Friday after. All right, so this is an interesting topic for executives because I think in a council environment, to some extent, you do have some freedom to change your organisational structures, but I really want you to think about this topic from a point of view of how it's actually contributing to performance. Now, as we know in local government, we talk about the silos. And what I find in local government is that it is very siloed, that one sort of department or division doesn't talk to another, or if they do, it's only on a needs basis. And this causes a lot of friction and difficulty, particularly, I guess, for people in the community who really aren't interested in silos. They just want their garbage to be collected and all the other services that you provide. So there's no such thing also, I should say, about the perfect organisational structure. So every organisational structure has its pitfalls. So no matter what what we might propose, they all have significant downfalls. So anyway, let's move into the topic and have a look at what we're covering. And just before we go into that, you'd be aware that, of course, at the beginning of the outset, I talked about strategically managing performance, and then you completed a diagnostic on the influencing capabilities framework. And last time we met 2 weeks ago was around creating thinking space and managing time. That, of course, is a very challenging topic, and I hope you've had a chance to start to look at your own work and how you might create that thinking space, because as I said last time, I believe that that's the business you're in. I think you're in the business at your level of leadership where you should be, you're basically paid to think, and you need to have that space to be able to do that. And often at your level, you're bombarded from left, right and centre about all sorts of things. So I hope that you've had a chance to reflect and review on that. And create some buffers, or what we call third spaces, between the various activities that you conduct inside your organisation. So today we're going to look at options for organisational structuring. And there are 3 things essentially I'd like to do today. I'd like to look at what your options are. So what are the options out there, the conventional options around organising? And what are their pitfalls and what are their strengths? No matter how we organise people, there's going to be some negatives and there's going to be some positives. So there's no, as I said before, perfect organisational structure. If there was, then of course we'd all be organising ourselves around that. I want to talk about a concept that O'Reilly and others talked about in several years ago, called the Ambidextrous Organisation, which is a great name. And I think it's very applicable to councils, because I think councils need to be ambidextrous. And most of us, when we think about ambidexterity, we think about being able to use our left hand or our right hand, which is precisely what this is about in terms of organisation. In other words, in the organisation, you need to be two things. You need to be flexible on the one hand, and you also need to be quite regulatory on the other. But unfortunately, as we know, councils are quite rigid in the way they do things, and freeing up and becoming a little bit more flexible in our thinking isn't a particularly easy thing to do. I'm sure at your level you've found that. And we'll talk about some tools to create a more agile organisation. So how do councils become more agile? What might they be able to do in order to create that? So a number of things we'll talk about in this short session that we've got in time together. Okay, so let's just now look at some of the different organising structures that are available to you. Now, councils, of course, have traditionally been organised around the functional model. Now, the functional model, as we'd be aware, is based on silos. So we have the marketing department, we have the operations and finance and so forth. Now, that's come out of the bureaucratic systems thinking, where bureaucracies were very much based on hierarchies, and that there were a number of different silos in a hierarchy. Now, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it, that you can organise things around disciplines, and that people can then coalesce around those disciplines, and that's great. The great strength of this model, of course, is that. But of course, the weakness is the cross-functional communication that goes on in a functional model is never quite as good as it could be. And even at your level, where you meet with your colleagues around the table, I'll guarantee that most of the meetings, conversations are around your functional area rather than how you might all work together. The reporting processes are geared towards your discipline area and so forth. So at your level of the organisation, you might like to think about how you might be able to break down the negative impacts of hierarchy, because clearly they're there, and I've worked in many of the councils around Queensland, and I haven't yet come across one where I found that it's working at optimal level. So there are issues around the functional approach. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that you throw it out, because it's got its values. It's got some great concepts to it, but we've also got to acknowledge there's some weaknesses as well. I wonder how we can plug the gaps for that. So that's one that you're all extremely familiar with, and you're aware of. I'm sure you're aware of the downfalls, the pitfalls of it. I'm sure you're aware also of the potential advantages if they're used effectively. And of course, councils, you've got to deal with the interface with the public, and the public really aren't all that interested in silos, and they just want their pothole filled, or they just want their garbage collected. They just, they want to know when the meeting's on. They're not interested in all the other stuff. So that's where it becomes problematic, because the public just see you essentially as one entity, although it's fair to say you're not just one entity, but they see you as one entity. So that's where it becomes problematic when you're dealing with the public. Now, you might recall, those of you around during amalgamation, of course, we created some more boundaries, didn't we, around bringing different entities together. And because those entities were brought together, that was another additional set of boundaries. In other words, there were different cultures that were merging in together. It was an unfortunate term, amalgamation, because really what it was about was really creating a new organising structure, of which there were several different entities joining together. So it was a great opportunity for regional councils particularly to start to look at creating a new organising entity rather than just joining or amalgamating several councils together. Now, one that you perhaps wouldn't be familiar with in your career in local government is that there is a product model. Now, the product model is really, if we take out functions and just replace them with products. So we have, for example, organisations that each department is a specialised area. All right, so there are a number of there are a number of different organisations. I'm just trying to think of the name of it now. There's a large American coffee company that's anyway. They have a number of different products, and each of those products have its own silo. So the advantage of this approach, of course, is that what you're doing is you're coalescing around a particular product. So it's not really effective for the necessarily for the Starbucks. Thanks, Graham. Thank you, Graham. Yeah, Starbucks. Starbucks is pretty much organised around this model as such. I think it uses a hybrid model actually, but yeah, thank you for that. But look, the whole purpose of this thing is that, we coalesce around a particular product brand. So we have HR, we have all the different functions within those silos. So for example, with this sort of approach, you would have here, say, an HR manager in each silo, perhaps reporting to a senior HR manager, but nevertheless you'd have, or you might have a senior admin officer in each of these different silos, who perhaps would meet with a senior admin officer who's trying to bring it all together. So look, the advantages of this is that, of course, their focus is on the product and the service. So from an organisational point of view, it's great. But the disadvantage, of course, is that cross-functional selling, again, the communication between the different silos isn't ideal. And so, because you've got sort of almost several separate businesses working together. Now, there's no way that council could move so dramatically from the one that I went through previously to this one. It's just not going to work. But what some councils have tinkered with is a hybrid version. And the hybrid version is what we call a matrix system. Now, the matrix model is based on a concept where you've got trying to get the best of both worlds. So it's about trying to get the best of the functional and the product world. So you have, as you can see on your screen, you've got your, let's say, 4 silos, and then across those silos you have a number of different projects. And your council environment, of course, it'll be project based, but you have a number of different products or whatever. So what it basically means is that as an individual employee, you are responsible for 2 bosses. You've essentially got 2 bosses. You've got your functional boss and you've got your project boss. Now, this can work very well, but it's really dependent on the level of communication in the organisation, because you can imagine the perils of this. If an employee, for example, is often going to be put in a position where they are wondering whether the project has greater priority over the functional aspects of their work. And of course, they can play 2 managers off. They can play one manager off and to the other manager, so they can, virtually blame the other manager for not getting something done or whatever. This is problematic, of course, in that sense. And I must admit, I haven't seen too many places where this works extremely well. So I am a little skeptical, because I think it requires the project leaders or product leaders, whichever way you want to look at it. But I suppose in a council environment, these would be major projects running across the organisation. It requires the project leaders to have very good understanding, not only of their role, where it starts and finishes, but also an appreciation and respect for the functional entities in the organisation as well. And for those project leaders to be able to have good working relationships with each of the functional heads, of which you may be one. So, it will work well where there are good relationships, there's good understanding, there's no power struggles or whatever. But of course, you can see that it could potentially be fraught with a difficulty as well. But I do see a lot of potential in councils to start to think about this a little bit further, because let's face it, most of the things you do in local government are basically, transcend a number of different functions. It's very rare to have something that's just completed in one functional area. And so therefore it might be worthwhile looking at some of the bigger projects that your council's operating in and consider how you might actually implement a matrix model if necessary to break down the silo impact. Now, this one that I'm going to show you now is my version, and it's come out of one of my books, and I put this together because I wanted to challenge people to think a little bit differently about their organising structures. Now, I'm not suggesting that local government move towards this model, but I think it's got some good, interesting points that you might want to consider in your own particular way, in your own organisation. Now, the first and obvious thing about the model is it's a series of concentric circles. So what we've done here is I've got rid of hierarchy. So the implication is that, we're not working in a hierarchy, we're all working. And you'll notice there's another interesting thing that I've done. I put the customers in the middle. Now, isn't it interesting on organising charts, we don't often refer to our customers or ratepayers or whoever they may be, which I find rather ironic, isn't it? Because the whole reason the organisation's there is actually for the betterment of the end user or the customer. So I put the customer in there purposely to remind us that customers are really important, no matter what they do. At the end of the day, we didn't have any customers, you didn't have any ratepayers, you wouldn't have a job. You wouldn't have an organisation. So we put them into the model right smack bang in the centre. And the implication of that is that that's where they should be. Everything we say, think and do should actually be in the interests of the customer. And often that, of course, goes, that's found wanting, isn't it? We don't often think like that. But really that's how we should be thinking. I just think it's funny, isn't it? We go out and we do a whole lot of consulting with the community. We get all of this information back and we build up a corporate plan. And then, of course, we deviate slowly but surely away from that corporate plan as the years progress. So we've just got to be very mindful that we're all working in a community. So that's the first interesting part of the model. Now, the second interesting thing, the third important element of this model is that you'll notice that the concentric circles have different, I guess you could say, functions in the organisation. So you'll notice that, for example, you've got frontline staff. Now, these could be customer service officers, community, people who bylaws, community, people who consult in the community. These are the frontline staff that deal directly with the customers. And so they're all grouped together because they've all got a specialised role, which of course is the interface with the customer. And then behind them, which is the next layer, we've got operations. Now, operations are really around the people that produce the goods or the services that are required for the front line to deal with the public. And you'll notice that there are dotted lines, and the dotted lines there are representing the different departments or organisations. So I'm honouring the functional model to some extent, but by using a dotted line, I'm simply implying that these people have a dual responsibility about being in their own functional area, but also they would reside within a department as such. Now, you'll notice there's another layer on the outer ring there, the second layer, the second last layer, which is called projects. Now, this is a relatively new concept, but there's a number of different organisations that are really experimenting with this, not so much in local government, I might say, but food for thought for you as a senior leader, that the projects are the various cross-functional projects that are going on where people can volunteer to be involved. And we call this organisational citizenship. So the whole notion of this is that people can then decide to be involved in some of the core responsibilities of the organisation above and beyond their current role. And I've given you a list on the page there. You can see that, for example, you could have a project team that's looking at improving the workplace culture. Or you could have a project team that's looking at rewards and incentives in local government. Or you could have a project team that's looking at innovation and continuous improvement overall. Or you could have we've all got a project team around safety and well-being. I mean, it's mandatory to have that. So that would be one of the obvious core project teams and is one of the obvious core project teams. So it's really about developing that concept further so that everyone in the organisation is given a second role, which is to be working on organisational-wide issues. So we might have a project team around recruitment and selection. So how might we make our recruitment and selection process more effective for those councils that are, rurally challenged? In other words, it's not so easy to get people, to lure people to your part of the woods. How do we do that? What sort of approaches could we use? In the city, it might be more around how do we improve and streamline our processes so that we can minimise making mistakes when we recruit people and select them. And then we're going to have a project team perhaps around the services and the products that we provide as a council. So that arguably everybody should be involved in one of those, and there's probably many, many other sort of project teams that you could have in your workplace. Now, the last layer you'll notice on the screen is the strategic. That's where the leaders are. So I put the leaders there because they have an overview looking in at the organisation and have an overview. So they oversee the project culture, they oversee the operations, they oversee the front line, and of course they oversee the customers and whether they're happy or not in terms of how they like to operate. So look, it's a fairly radical model. I'm not suggesting that your local government can be turned into that overnight, but there's a couple of concepts that I'm going to build on later on in this presentation that I'd like you to think carefully about. What are the weaknesses of this model? Well, it's not quite so easy to transition, of course, from a functional model to a customer-centric model, but the important point about this model is that the customer is at the centre of all decision making, so that we make sure that we're there for the reasons of the community and not for our own reasons. So that's the approach. It might be something that you might want to think about. It's not that simple, of course, to go from where you are, but I'm just throwing ideas out there. I want you to be thinking about these sorts of things. And if you can take bits and pieces from various things and go for your life, I think that's very, very useful. Okay, now, one of the things that I mentioned at the outset was this concept of an ambidextrous organisation. Now, in the Harvard Business Review several years ago, I've forgotten his first name, but O'Reilly et al. Wrote a very interesting article called the Ambidextrous Organisation. And what he was really arguing was that organisations need to have two sets of values. They need to have the values around stability and rigidity and predictability and efficiency, and they need to be built around those because it's important to have some stability in the organisation. Now, in local government, of course, because you're a public enterprise, the public do expect for their rates that there will be some systems and procedures and processes and so forth, frameworks, that you will operate by. They expect that, and from my experience, local government does a very good job on that. Now, but there is something else, and this is what O'Reilly was talking about when he talked about the need for ambidexterity. He argued he argues, and I think it's a very good argument, is that while organisations can be, basically predictable and efficient and all the rest, they also need to be flexible. They need to be adaptable. They need to evolve. They need to be scalable, and they need to be able to operate with greater speed. And of course, that's a slightly different concept to the one around stability. In fact, it's polar opposite. So to be able to juggle this is no easy feat. But there are organisations all over the world that are struggling with trying to have both sets of values inculcated in their organisation, and rightly so. So it's not a simple thing, but let me give you a very practical way that you might be able to do this in your teams. So when you get your coordinators together, or whoever it might be, your managers, you get them in a room. One of the things you might like to do is what you do is you draw 2 lines down the centre on a whiteboard. So you're going to do this with your team. And then on the left-hand side, because you've got three spaces there. Now, on the left-hand side, you ask the question, what are all the things that we can make decisions on that aren't based on a system or a process, things that we have the freedom to be able to make up our mind about how we do things, or perhaps even when we do it. Now, you'll find people will struggle with this initially to put things up there, but keep working at it, and you'll find a few things will go up there. So try and exhaust the list wherever possible. And then go to the other side, which is the right-hand side, and then ask people the question, right, what's the opposite? What are all the things that have to be done by a very delineated, clear system and a process? Things such as health and safety, for example, would go on the list. So we'd make a list, and you'd find that list is going to be a lot longer because that's the nature of the work that you do. There's an imbalance around the ambidexterity. We're all right-handed, and very few of us use our left hand, so to speak. But anyway, you put everything up there. And so what's the middle column? Now, the middle column is all around, this is where people, you ask the question, what are some areas where we could either follow the system or we can pretty much go with our gut? Now, there might be some struggle with this, so you need to think of a few examples before you throw it out to your team. But nevertheless, you're probably going to have a list there as well. Now, this is a good exercise because what it does is it creates a clear understanding with your managerial team around the areas that require complete and utter orthodoxy. They require you to follow a system and do it to the letter. And it also gives people license to understand that there are some particular things as a manager that people can make decisions on. You might get some debate in your team about this, and that's not a problem. I think it's a good thing that you discuss these things. And then you look at the middle column, and as a team, what you decide to do is what you decide to do. So what are we going to do in these circumstances? Should we follow the system, or should we, have complete enterprise and agility? And of course, once the team has made up their mind, you as the senior leader have got to be able to make sure that people adhere to that. So that's a way of making your managerial team ambidextrous. It's getting them to think about their work in terms of the flexibility around using the left hand or the right hand. And if you can do that at your level, that is your managerial level, then obviously that's going to filter down to the organisation overall. So give that some careful thought and think about how you might introduce that in one of your team meetings, because I think you'll get some great results from that. This is a very busy slide, but essentially what you've got in the middle column there is, well, local government 101, isn't it? These are all things that very much are features of the hierarchical organising structure. Top down, concentrated, vertical, permanent, rule-based, and it goes on and on and on. What I'm challenging you with today is to simply think, well, how can we maintain those things? All right, so I'm not suggesting we get rid of them. Some of them are very useful. But how can we also implement some new ways of thinking in our organisations so that we, in fact, can become more ambidextrous? And, all of those things that are on the right-hand side, and I won't run through them all of those things, of course, are the left hand that I was talking about, the right hand versus the left hand. So you've got to create a culture where it is possible to have two sets of values, one around stability, one set, and one around agility, which is another set. So have a think about how you might do that. And, again, I think it's important to talk to your managers about this. Some of your managers, of course, have got a very strong bias towards one or the other. I'm sure you've seen it. Some managers, of course, that have come from private enterprise struggle very much with the red tape and the various things that have to be done in local government. But they need to understand that it's important that it does add some value where it does, of course. But on the other hand, they may feel very inclined to be quite agile, and so they add value if they manage correctly. And then you've got other people in your workplace that are very rule bound, very, very strict, and very, very, everything has to be done by the letter. And of course, your job there is to get them to be a little bit more flexible in their thinking, because if they think like that, it's just going to permeate all the way through the organisation. Anyway, so what it does is it create, your organising structure actually does create a set of values. And you only have to talk to someone that's come from private enterprise moving into a council to just sort of talk to them about what they find easy and what they find difficult. And it's quite enlightening to talk to them about that. Oop, went too far. Okay. Now, in one of my books, Performance Management for Agile Organisations, I developed this model that I think you might find quite useful in your own workplace in terms of developing the agility side of ambidexterity. So I've often thought to myself, there's a lot of sort of talk about being agile out there. People are all saying everyone's got to be agile, we're going to have an agile organisation and all the rest of it. That's all very fine, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But the problem that I have with that is that there's very few models out there to show people, or frameworks to actually show people what that actually looks like. What do we actually mean by agile, and how can we actually go about measuring agility? So these things have not often been discussed. So let's actually have a look starting at 12 o'clock, and we'll work our way around the model. And I just want to talk about these things. As I go through them, I want you to have a think, and by all means ask me any questions as we go. But have a think about how these impact on your organisation. All right. When I say your organisation, I'm talking about your patch within council, and your job is to create a culture within a culture, of course. Of course, if you're the CEO, then it's about creating a total culture. But anyway, so innovation. Now, the key thing for, I know local government's been banging on for quite a while about being innovative, and I don't think it's about the Google's type of innovation. It's really about coming up with better, faster, easier ways of being able to do things. Actually, the difference between innovation and continuous improvement is subtle but important. Innovation is coming up with a completely new way of doing things, whereas continuous improvement is just simply continuing on a way that we're already doing something. But local government, I think, has a huge opportunity to be innovative. So, and look, there's some good examples around Queensland. I'm sure you can think of those examples, or you've heard of those examples. There is enormous scope for local government to be more innovative, to create new services, to consolidate services, to be able to do things differently. I have no doubt about that, but unfortunately, because the organisation is so strongly focused on hierarchy, it's not always simple to get people to come forward with those ideas. But it's important. We need to be innovative. Now, that's all about getting. Look, if you think about a commercial example like Apple were the first company to come up with touchscreen technology. Now, touchscreen technology is wonderful. We all use it and we all think it's great. But in the early days, Apple were the only ones that have come up with that. So therefore, they took this huge advantage in the marketplace because they were so quick to market on that. And of course, everyone caught up eventually. So innovation's important. The second thing on the list there that's important is processing speed. This is really, really critical to council. So how can we do things faster in local government? How can we actually get product or whatever it is that we're doing done quicker? How can we get quicker decision making? How can we get greater processing speed? You as a senior leader have a real responsibility to champion that, because I would imagine that most of you would think that things are moving too slowly in most cases. And if you can't grab that by the reins and do something about it at your level, then it's probably not going to get done. So really, it's very, very important for you to start thinking about how you might do that. So how can we get processes in place? One of the things I strongly recommend that you do is to do a processing audit. If you go into your own workplace and someone says, oh, I'm just following the book, I'm just doing it like this way, just say, why are you doing it like that? And they say, well, it's just how we do things. And just say, well, what happens if we didn't have that process? Would anything be a problem? And if they say to you, no, not really, well, get rid of the process. I think, councils would err on the side of having too many processes than not enough. And if someone's going to recommend putting another process in place, then play devil's advocate and say, well, what's the value that that's going to bring? What are the pitfalls that that process might create that we haven't thought of? So test people out on that. So processing is very important to council. I think you've got a huge opportunity to look at how you do things, use process maps, look at how you do things, break things down to simpler size pieces and what have you. Now, the next area, which is an interesting one, is recovery. Now, recovery is all about when a mistake is made, and mistakes surely are made. Whenever you've got human beings, you've got mistakes. So because there are mistakes being made, the question is not how do we eliminate all our mistakes? You can't. It's impossible. We're all going to make mistakes. The question then becomes how do we recover as quickly as we can from our mistakes? Now, I find that the public is very forgiving if someone's made a mistake and has owned up to it quickly and fixed it. Where the public is not very forgiving, and rightly so, is where an organisation doesn't accept responsibility for the mistake, passes the buck or blame. And secondly, not only do they not accept it, they'll do nothing about it because they don't accept it. Now, that is a surefire sign for a huge problem. So, for example, if you just take a simple example, you go into a restaurant and you order a meal, and let's say the waiter brings out the wrong meal. You then protest and you say, well, look, I ordered the fish, not the steak. And then the person apologises to you, they go away, and within 10 minutes they bring back the correct meal. Now, the chances are, assuming all things being equal, your mood and how nice the food is and everything else, the chances are you'd probably be more forgiving if they accepted responsibility for that mistake and went away and fixed it. So what I want you to do is to think about how you create a culture in your organisation around taking ownership of your mistakes and being able to deal with them as effectively and efficiently as possible. that would be a huge step in the right direction from my experience working in local government. Now, the next area on the list is continuous improvement. Now, as I mentioned, there was I've explained the difference between continuous improvement and innovation. So it's really, really important to think about making improvements on every single thing that you do every single day and so forth. And the places to start, interestingly enough, is where you spend considerable amounts of time. So, you've almost got to have an ear for continuous improvement. You can create a culture in your organisation of continuous improvement if you set the example and you continually bang on about it. What about if you gave away a couple of movie tickets or something for some of the clever ideas about making things more effective in your area? Could you do that? Could you sponsor some of that? Could you challenge your managers to go back to their areas and develop a culture of continuous improvement? This is one of the big challenges for local government, in my view, is to become more continuous improvement oriented, because this is another one of those ambidextrous concepts that are really important. I think too often we hear people saying things like, oh, we've always done it this way, or, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And you probably get this all the time. Well, first of all, make sure you're not the one saying it, because that's not a good start. But secondly, I think, if you hear it, then challenge it. Challenge people when they say these things, because if you don't challenge it, it's almost like you're accepting that what they're saying is real. And as soon as the old adage is what you walk past is what you accept. So if you just accept this sort of language, you'll find that people will continue to talk like that, which isn't going to be very helpful for you. Customer responsiveness. Now, obviously, it's all about, being responsive to the needs of the customer. Local government can do enormously better in this area, and I know you know that. How do we do better in this area? Now, I realise the public often, it doesn't matter what you do. You give them free beer and they complain it was not cold. I know the public will be very upset with you no matter what you do. But that's not a reason not to continue to try and improve your own particular customer focus. So how do you become more responsive to the customer? How do you become more aware? That's the challenge for you. Do you have a survey? Do you have a survey that determines, are a lot of your customers internal, by the way, or your customers external? Have you inculcated a customer culture in your own organisation? Interesting question. Problem solving. The capacity to solve problems is now becoming the big thing, because there are so many unique problems that occur, not just in local government, but right across the whole spectrum of industry. There are so many unique things that occur. We need to have new, better, faster and easier ways of doing things. So having a flexible customer problem-solving capability is extremely important. And finally, and I guess you could say all of the things that I've mentioned, all 6 of them, come under the banner of direction change. So this is about how we change direction. Organisations change direction. I don't mean dramatically, but to meet the needs. I mean, when a new council comes in, for example, if you've had a serious turnover with your councillors, then it's inevitable that there'll be a new direction for the organisation, because the councillors that have been elected will have a different platform. And because you work in those dynamic organisations, that will always be an issue of that for you. So what I'm doing there is giving you a framework to be able to assess your own potential to be flexible in your own workplace using these criteria. Now, I did mention earlier when I showed you the customer-centric model, I did introduce the concept of organisational citizenship. I'm just going to introduce it again to you because I think it's really useful to think about this. And really, what do I mean by a organisational citizenship? Well, simply this. In industrial and organisational psychology, organisational citizenship is a person's voluntary commitment within an organisation that is not part of his or her contractual tasks. So what that means, of course, is that people have basically wear two hats, if you like. They have their functional hat, which is the job, what's on their job description, and that's what they're expected to do. But there's another hat, which is an organisational hat. That is where they're taking responsibility for other things. I think it's probably a little bit too early in local government for me to be pushing this barrow around organisational citizenship. But I think you should think about it because I think this will be the future of local government. In fact, I think it'll be the future of any organisations where people are involved in project teams to help the organisation resolve cross-functional problems on the one hand, and also on the other hand, they're involved in the the functional aspects of what they get paid to do. And there are some organisations now that are doing this, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. I mean, Google and places like that, of course. I'm not suggesting that you need to be, you're not a Google or what have you, but there are organisations that are moving in this direction about saying to people, we want you to be a citizen of the organisation as well as an employee. So we want you to be able to contribute to some of the things that I mentioned earlier on. So it's a concept that I might ask you to think about. And, at a very simple level, what's wrong with you getting a group of people together, 6 or 7 people that have got a special brand of talent and skill in your particular area of the business? What's to stop them getting together and resolving an issue internally in your organisation? And, in a very impromptu sense. And you just ask them to get on with the job and come up with some recommendations around some particular issue that you face. You might be surprised. I think you find people, if you pick the right people, they'll be quite happy about being picked. It'll give them some stimulating things to do. I mean, that's not in lieu of their work, it's around their work, but it's being a citizen of the organisation. So I think there are things you can do, but whether you could do this in a systemic way at the moment is probably not likely, but eventually you'll be faced with it. There's no question. So what are the takeaways out of all this? I guess I'll just pause there for a minute. Do you have any questions or comments you want to ask me in relation to any of this material? Because I've been a bit provocative, and I purposely try to do that because I'm trying to get people to think and to consider their role as the leader in the organisation. But if you've got questions or comments or observations, I'm more than ready to hear them. So have a think about that. And while you're doing that, I'll perhaps give a little bit of a summary of what I've covered today and give you a chance perhaps to put fingers to keyboards and send me a question or a comment or an observation. So what are some of the things that we've covered today that are important principles out of all this? Well, I think, from your point of view, as a senior member of the organisation, one of the things that I think is really important for you is to recognise that you wear two hats. You wear your functional hat, which you're probably in charge of. So this is the work that you do that's on your job description and the people that work in your area. So you have a hat to wear, and of course that's a well-worn hat, and people in local government are very familiar with that hat. But there is another hat, and that is the organisational hat. At your senior level, it's really important to understand that you've got to take a global view. You've got to not be parochial about how you look at things. and try and look at things from a broader perspective than just your functional area. And that's not as easy as it sounds. So there's always a juggle. So whenever an executive team comes together, I always believe that it should be about issues that are cross-functional as much as it is about things that are happening in your functional area. I would argue that at least 50% of the meeting should be around the cross-functional aspects of what goes on. Because if the executive team aren't willing to tackle those issues, then let me ask you, who is? Who's going to do it? So it's very important in those meetings that we talk about cross-functional problems where there are a number of different functions involved. So that's one key message I want you to take away with you today. Another one is that, and I guess it's aligned with the first one, is the agenda should consider cross-functional issues. There's a number of creative things that you can do here. Invite people from other departments to come and address your team for 15 minutes. Go to some other departments and address their meeting for 15 minutes. Try some different things in that regard, because you might be surprised at what you learn. And in turn, that department or that team might be surprised at what they learn. So breaking down these boundaries is if it's not going to happen at your level, it's not happening at all. So understand that. Now, another thing, and this occurred in a council that I worked in, but it wasn't very successful, and it'll remain nameless. But what we decided to do is, I said to the executive, are you serious about wanting to genuinely break down the silos? And they said yes. And I said, well, the first thing you've got to do is rotate all your roles so that the engineer now becomes the administrator. And, you know, the corporate services person now becomes the engineer, and so on. So we actually rotate the senior team across various functions. Everyone was fairly enthusiastic about that idea until I actually handed them that, until we were just about ready to roll that out, and then people got cold feet. Someone would say to me, well, what will happen if we don't know what we're doing? I say, well, you've got colleagues there. You can talk to your other colleagues. You can ask them how they deal with this situation. I'm sure they will be quite happy to help you. So it was about creating a little bit more cohesiveness in the executive team as well. But anyway, it was interesting. And then someone said, well, can we just put another page attached to the generic job description? Because essentially it was about leadership, and they wanted all the functional aspects listed out. So that was interesting, but it didn't really get off the ground. But what an interesting concept. If you could rotate your senior team, now I'm not meaning forever. I mean, it might be just for 4 weeks. Just go for 4 weeks and just trial it. I'll guarantee the place won't burn down. I'll guarantee that things will probably be going better than they went before, believe it or not. I'll guarantee you'll learn some new skills working in another area. I'll guarantee it'll sharpen up your leadership capabilities as well. So there's a lot of value in it, but it's just people are so wedded to their functional area of responsibility, they forget that. Now, you need, as a senior leader, you need to be trying to facilitate more cross-functional teams, project teams, teams across different functions, where you get 2 teams together from different functions working on a similar project that they both have a vested interest in. This is really important, because if you don't do it, it doesn't get done, and that's really important. I mentioned earlier to use surveys. I think most councils now do survey their public, but I think it's very important. It's very important to get some feedback about what the public think of you and how you're doing your job. So be prepared to survey, and be prepared. Now, this is the key thing. It's all very well doing surveys, but what you really need to do is to actually then use the survey as a catalyst for a conversation internally around how you might become more customer centric. That becomes really important. And my final point there is that people are tribal. And what I mean by that is that my belief is that people will just naturally gravitate to groups and other groups in the community no matter what. So what that means for you is that no matter what you do in terms of organisational structuring, you will not get rid of the barriers or the tribes, as I mentioned. The question then becomes, are the tribes actually working for you or against you? That's the question. It's not how do we get rid of tribes. The question is how do we improve to make sure that the tribes work better together? And that's the note that I'd like to finish on. All right, so you've been very quiet. You've been a very quiet group today. I'm either doing something right or wrong, but anyway, let's move on. The homework I want to give you here, folks, is, well, it's a bit of thinking homework actually, but it might be a bit of doing homework as well. But I want you to consider your organisational structure. I've thrown a lot of things at you in a short space of time this afternoon. But what I'd like you to think about is to answer this question. It's not a very easy question to answer, I might say, but I'd like you to have a go at it because as far as I'm concerned, it's an important question, and that is, how can you make your your structure, that is the structure that you're in charge of, more efficient and effective? What ideas can you take out of today's workshop or today's broadcast? What can you take out of it that could actually improve the capacity of your area of the organisation to be more efficient and effective? That's the big challenge for all of you today. So folks, I might just leave it at that. Thanks again for putting up with the change of schedule. I don't like to do that, and I promise you, I can't. I suppose I better not make a promise, but I wasn't expecting to do it this time. But I'll certainly do everything I can not to change it. So you can probably bank on the dates staying as they are. But I'd just like to thank each of you. Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. So have a good think about your own structure. How can you improve things in your own world to make it more effective? I think I've just got a question here before we... thanks you. Very thought-provoking. Thanks very much, Corin, is it? Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate the feedback. That's great. So, folks, that's it for me. So all the best. Have a great week, and we'll catch up in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.